Thank you very much for coming to Lesson 1 of the ISKCON Hermeneutics course. So the first thing that we're going to do for every class is that we are going to go deeply into the meditations. So if you turn to your participants' handbook for this lesson, starting on page 9. So we're going to please say this together, but keep yourselves on mute. And when we say these meditations, we want to try to enter deeply into the mood so that we are preparing our consciousness to study how to study scripture. And those of you who've taken time to look through the course beforehand, you will notice that having the proper consciousness and the proper mood is just as important as learning the techniques. In fact, one could say it's part of the techniques, as Prabhupada gave in the first purpose of ISKCON, that we are to teach the techniques of spiritual life. So one technique of spiritual life is that before we enter on anything, that we take shelter of the Lord. So we have a different meditation for each lesson, so that particularly we are going to take shelter in the mood of that lesson. Okay. So we have several meditations here. We'll say the first one again, keep yourselves on mute. We'll say it together. Tatra kirta yato vipra vipraser bhuri tejasaha aham chadyagamam tatra divistastadanugrahat soham vashravayishyami yataditam yatamati. We'll say the translation again together, but please stay on mute. O learned Brahmanas, when Sukadeva Goswami recited Bhagavatam there in the presence of Emperor Parikshit, I heard him with rapt attention, and thus, by his mercy, I learned the Bhagavatam from that great and powerful sage. Now I shall try to make you hear the very same thing as I learned from him, and as I have realized it. So we have this meditation here for this lesson, where we're looking at what is hermeneutics? Because we can tell by this verse, it's not only repeating what we have heard, but it is also what we have realized. Okay, our next meditation. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Daya Karaha Vichara Vichara Karile Chitte Pave Chatmatkara. If you are indeed, again, please say together, if you are indeed interested in logic and argument, kindly apply it to the mercy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. If you do so, you will find it to be strikingly wonderful. So we are going to be applying logic and argument to the mercy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and hopefully finding it strikingly wonderful. In our last meditation for today, Shri Bhadrai Nirvacha Evam Te Bhagavanduta Yamaduta Bibashitam Upadaryata Tanrajan Prachahurnayako Vidaha. Translation, we can say it together. Sukadeva Goswami said, my dear king, the servants of Lord Vishnu are always very expert in logic and arguments. After hearing the statements of the Yamadutas, they replied. So to become expert in logic and arguments is what we are going to try to do in today's class and in the lessons ahead of us. All right. So we've talked a little bit about the importance of entering into prayer, of having a mood of prayer. And we really cannot overstate that importance. So whenever we want to understand the words of Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, whenever we want to discuss the words of Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, first, there must be a preparation of consciousness. There must be a preparation of consciousness. And that is always the case. It's a very important part of our understanding of Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. All right, so we might say, well, what is hermeneutics? All right, the word itself derives from the Greek god Hermes, who is the messenger of the gods. Of course, in the Vedas, Agni is the messenger between the gods and between gods and humans, and also has a lot to do with human speech. All right, let's look at, and all of you should be prepared with your foundation document. And your participants manual. And as we suggested, we really suggest you have these two printed out, unless you have like two huge screens and you can just easily go between screens. We are sometimes also, this big book, sometimes going to be referring to the supplementary material, and maybe some of you will have that printed out as well. I know it's hefty and it's a big printing thing. And we know from having taught this before that sometimes participants are like, which book do I go to? So all of us instructors will try to make things very clear. All right, so let's look at the foundation document, page 3. You can open the foundation document to page 3. And there you will see the definition of ISKCON Hermeneutics. So maybe we could have Pancharatna Prabhu. Would you unmute yourself and read that for us, please?
By ISKCON Hermeneutics, we refer to the discipline and methodology that considers how to appropriately study, understand, apply, explain, and perpetuate the teachings of Guru, Sadhu, Shastra. Such a discipline comes from the Vaishnava tradition itself. Hermeneutics embraces theory and method underpinned by values. For Vaishnavas, proper understanding and teaching are contingent upon character and realization.
Thank you so much. Yes. So the Greek word hermeneutics means to express or to translate. Now, it can also mean to interpret, which we're going to be discussing today, as this is one of the main questions that people ask. It's a question that I get from GBC members. You know, do we interpret? Isn't it just as it is? The other question we get is, why do we use the Greek word hermeneutics? Now, the word hermeneutics is certainly related to Bible study, but the hermeneutics we are studying is fully based in the Vedic tradition. And our evidence for that, again, is in this huge supplementary materials book. We could have used the word mimamsa. The word mimamsa is used in the Vedas. It's a Vedic technique of doing the same thing as hermeneutics, interpreting or explaining Shastra. But as we explain in the supplementary materials, the problem is that some of mimamsa has to do with karma kanda and smarta principles. So we at the Shastric Advisory Council were in a bit of a quandary. If we use the word mimamsa, people might think, oh, the Shastric Advisory Council is applying karma kanda and smarta principles to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And if we use the word hermeneutics, people are going to think, oh, the Shastric Advisory Council is using some sort of Christian interpretation method for our Vedic scriptures. So what word were we going to use? And the GBC had initially asked us to use the word hermeneutics. So that's the word that we've used. Yes, it's a little hard to say, a little hard to spell. After a while, one will get used to it. All right, so why is it important to study hermeneutics? And you might think of an example of a scriptural passage that you're familiar with that has several different interpretations. In fact, what I'd like to ask right now is if different participants can write in the chat window, what is a Shastric passage that you're familiar with or a statement from Srila Prabhupada? When we say Shastra here, we're meaning that as an umbrella term. Any of the statements of Srila Prabhupada, any statements from our previous acharyas, anything from the Shastra, something that has more than one interpretation. And I'd love to welcome each of you personally. And Radhakrishna Guru, so nice to see you here today. We're very enlivened that we have some members of the GBC with us today. So if you could please put in the chat anything that you know of from Shastra that could have more than one interpretation. And welcome to Krishna Das Kaviraj, who's the chair of the deputies. Mission, yeah. I like that one of our participants, Vinata, I think, put in Atma. Sometimes Atma is interpreted by Srila Prabhupada as God, and sometimes as the Jiva, and sometimes both in one purport. Who is a Vaishnava? Yes, that is. Recently I heard one temple president say online, the devotees in our movement, they're just ordinary people. They're not Vaishnavas. The Atmarama verse, yes, Mahaprabhu gave over 60 different explanations of that verse, yes. All right, so what we're going to do now, and this was, I'm doing this because Radhika Raman Prabhu did this, so I'm teaching his lesson, so I'm following in his footsteps. He decided that it might be helpful to take as an example a Bible verse. And the reason he thought that that would be a good idea is that none of us are going to have any emotional context with that. Whereas if we started with an example of a verse from our own scripture, people might have some strong feelings. All right, so we're going to take a verse from the Bible, Matthew 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And he gives some examples, Radhika Raman Prabhu, who, again, if you've joined late, he has COVID. He's recovering at home, and therefore, with great apologies for being a teacher far inferior to him, I am teaching his lesson at his request. So looking at Christian hermeneutics, there are several different ways one could interpret this statement of Jesus. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So if we're going to take the literal meaning out of context, it would mean if you're humble, you can expect to become king of the world. Now, this is definitely not what Jesus meant. The most common Christian understanding is if we are humble, we are elevated in the eyes of God, and in the end time, when the Lord makes his will known on earth, we'll be part of that. Or maybe if we're humble, we'll get glory in heaven. Now, there's some historical context to this statement, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, that Jesus is speaking this to the Jews when they are terribly oppressed and persecuted by the Roman powers of the time. And many Jews are expecting a Messiah, not who's going to tell them to turn the other cheek and be humble, but someone who's going to lead them out of oppression by military means. So Jesus's words, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, are powerful and radical, telling them to be humble and turn the other cheek and just resist in their heart. Now, there's a Marxist theory of interpretation of these words, because just before saying, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And Marx said, yeah, this is what religion does. It takes the poor and the humble and tells them, stay meek, keep your voices down, so that the rich and the powerful can continue to exploit you. Religion is a tool for the oppression and the exploitation of the masses by the few who are powerful and rich. Now, obviously, most Christians would not appreciate this interpretation. But I think you can understand when we give this example that we have people out there who are very critical of ISKCON and very critical of Srila Prabhupada. And they take some statements from Srila Prabhupada and some statements from our acharyas and from the Shastra and interpret them exactly in ways like this. An interpretation according to liberation theology, which is influenced by Marx but has a positive direction, is that Jesus here is standing next to those who are poor, oppressed, and weak. He's the friend of the poor. He helps the poor. He lifts them up. He stands in solidarity with the weak and the poor and allows their voices to be heard. This is a call to action for all Christians to fight poverty and oppression. So that's quite a different interpretation. Right? Are meek people going to become kings of the earth? Are they going to be first in heaven? Is this just showing that religion oppresses people? Or is this showing that people should engage in social welfare work for social justice? So our question is, what guides our explanation, understanding, and interpretation? For this, we need principles, and then we need tools to apply the principles. Now, I've many times run into devotees who think, oh, hermeneutics is always going to give us one answer, one explanation, one interpretation that then by fiat, everybody will have to accept. Well, that may be true in some cases where there's just one explanation. But at the same time, Srila Prabhupada told us that we should examine the scripture from many angles of vision. So more often than coming up with the one correct answer, it is a question of how do we reach good conclusions with good conversations. Now, you had in your participants' handbook this essay by Radhika Raman Prabhu on page 13. And the other times that we've taught this course, we were very fortunate that the vast majority of our participants did all of the home fun. You notice we don't call it homework because Trusanticha, Ramanticha. So they did all of the home fun for all of the lessons. And by doing that, it allows us in the lessons to focus primarily on using hermeneutics rather than talking about it. And this lesson 1 is a little bit of an exception where it's much more of a talking about it than using it. But in most of our lessons, at least a third, sometimes a half, sometimes 7/8 of the time, as in the last lesson, where we really get to use everything we've learned, is going to be you're actually go out and using things. In order to do that, we count on you to study the theory and the materials before the classes. If you don't do that, you'll be lost, and you'll also drag down the other participants in the breakout room. So having boundaries, really an excellent essay. If you haven't already read it as part of your home fun, please read it after this class. What hermeneutics is doing, it's protecting the tradition. It's protecting the core identity of the tradition. So there's a boundary within which you can function, but outside of which you can't. Outside of the boundary is changing the very identity, the very core of the tradition. But inside the boundary, we have a multiplicity of understanding. Srila Prabhupada did direct that the GBC every year should discuss unity in diversity. And a hermeneutic system is the key to achieving this unity in diversity. It's like the court, as Radhika Raman Prabhu put it, of a tennis game, and the net and the rules. So you can play a large variety of games within that structure. One way we know that we're using hermeneutics properly, one way we know that we are understanding and explaining and interpreting the words of Srila Prabhupada, our acharyas, and the Shastra properly, is much chitta madgita pranam bodayantas prosperam kathayantas jamam nityam tushyanticha ramanticha. Good hermeneutics brings, someone needs to mute. Good hermeneutics brings satisfaction and joy to the soul. It is not merely an intellectual exercise. And we're going to be doing an exercise a little later on in this lesson where we think about times when that happened with us and times when it didn't. Just imagine if in our International Society for Krishna Consciousness, every time we discussed the words of Srila Prabhupada, our acharyas, and the Shastra, we felt an increase in joy and satisfaction. We felt enlivened. We felt as if we've been, plugged in and we're connected with the Lord. What a wonderful society it would be. And we wouldn't get difficulty with asking people to join or to stay. I want to emphasize, and we have this in our participants handbook, but I really want to emphasize that this course is a safe space. We are going to be, in the process of this course, discussing some of the most difficult, controversial, and difficult to understand statements from Srila Prabhupada and from the scripture. Participants are going to be discussing things that they've personally struggled with, or that they know is a difficulty for other devotees, or a difficulty for outreach. And we're going to need to do that, otherwise we can't apply hermeneutics. What's the use of hermeneutics if we can't apply it to the most difficult and controversial statements? But we don't want people to feel hesitant. Oh, if I bring up my doubts about this statement, I'm going to be judged. Therefore, it is very important that we encourage each other with being honest about discussing things that are difficult. In order to make this a safe space, we do not make recordings of these classes publicly available. However, we have gotten requests to have some kind of an online webinar. So what we will be doing is giving these recordings to a video editing expert in Melbourne, Dr. Russell. He is going to take this class and edit out anything from the participants. So it's just going to be the lecture portion from the teacher with a break time for those watching it to be able to do the interactive exercises on their own. In this way, we can give assurance to everyone that this is an absolutely safe space. I should mention that we're going to do a lot of breakout rooms. If you can see somebody on the participants list that for whatever reason you do not feel safe with, please let one of the admins know that you do not want to be in a breakout room with that person, and we will accommodate you. So the basis of the entire course, we have our little motto: theory and method underpinned by values, and you will see that in every lesson. Theory and method underpinned by values. Maybe staying on mute, but if everybody could repeat that. Theory and method underpinned by values. By theory, we mean the principles of hermeneutics. By method, we mean the tools. We have 24 principles and an overarching principle. By method, we mean the tools. We have 40 tools. And by values, we mean Vaishnav qualities. So in lesson 2 tomorrow with His Holiness Bhaktivigyan Maharaj, you'll be going through a hermeneutic path where you'll be using right away these principles, tools, and qualities in dealing with difficult statements. So in lesson 2, we're jumping right in to actually using them with the hermeneutic path that's in the foundation manual. But then we're going to go more deeply. In lesson 3, we're going to be discussing the different kinds of conversation, getting deeply into the Vaishnav qualities. That will be with our expert Hari Parshad Prabhu. And then in lesson 4 with Chaitanya Charan, you'll be doing half the lesson on Vaishnav qualities and half on principles. Then with Kartik Chandra Prabhu, in our 5th lesson, you'll be using the tools. And then in the 6th lesson with His Holiness Krishna Kshetra Maharaj, we'll be discussing times when it's really hard to get an answer at all? What do we do? And then in lesson 7 with Gopal Hari Prabhu, we'll be discussing outreach. How do we deal with difficult statements when we're dealing with the public? And lesson 8 brings it all together. In lesson 8, you're going to be using all of these, all of the theory, all of the methods, all of the values in 3 different exercises. So keep this in mind. Theory and method underpinned by values. All right. So now I'd like you to turn to the prep work you did. And in each lesson, we're going to have varying degrees of going over your prep work. So in some lessons, it's just going to be your prep work. We won't go over it all. In some, we're just going to touch on it. In this particular lesson, we're going to go into it perhaps a little bit more deeply than we usually do. All right, so I'd like you to turn in your participants' handbook to pages 8 and 9, which you all completed before the class. All right, and now what we're going to do is ask various people to raise their hand, and then our admins can spotlight them. And we're going to ask about the particular question, what did Srila Prabhupada mean by as it is? What did Srila Prabhupada mean by as it is? So we're asking people if they can raise their hand. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And it's quite interesting that you were saying that, because in our principles, principle number 20, it says texts are understood according to the mood and intent of the author and speaker. And we have 21, we understand Srila Prabhupada's statements by his application of them in relation to his mood and mission. So yes, thank you. Excellent, excellent. Anybody else would like to weigh in? Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, so you're reading from the supplementary materials, the section written by Hari Parshad Prabhu. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Prabhu from Hungary. Yes, yes. In fact, that is again under the principles in our foundation book on page 6. We see principle 21. We understand Srila Prabhupada's statements by his application of them in relation to his mood and mission, and that truth is conveyed with logic, reason, and exemplary character through the system of parampara. And 23, parampara is perpetrated through discernment of meaning more than mere repetition of words. And then again, in general, in 20, according to the mood and intent of the author speaker. And a lot of the way we understand somebody's mood and intent is by how they apply them. Yes. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. And you just opened the door to one of the main things we'll be discussing in tomorrow's lesson. And one of the points in tomorrow's lesson is just foundational to this whole course. And that is being able to say which truths of the Shastra are eternal, universal, and transcontextual. Which truths of the Shastra is eternal, universal, and transcontextual. And a very simple example that I always give is when Krishna says to Arjuna, stand and fight. Is that an eternal, universal, transcontextual statement? I'm sitting right now and I'm not fighting. I think most of you are sitting and hopefully none of you are fighting. So to be able to distinguish what is an eternal, universal, transcontextual truth and what is not is one of the things that we look at in this hermeneutics course, and particularly we're going to be focusing on that tomorrow. Okay, let's move on to the next. And I'm so glad you brought that up. That was like a whole segue to one of the key elements of hermeneutics. We have 4 ways of understanding statements in relationship to Siddhanta, what is eternal, universal, and transcontextual. What is a contextualization of that, what is supporting that, and what may surprise you, what opposes that. Let's look at a closely related question. So, as we detailed in the supplementary materials, Srila Prabhupada often disapproved of the word interpretation. So, how did Srila Prabhupada use this word? Because again, you go to the dictionary definition of Mimamsa and you'll find how to interpret Vedic texts. You go to the dictionary definition of hermeneutics and you're going to find how to interpret texts. So, how do we deal with this word interpretation? Anybody that would like to weigh in on this? Wow. I wish we'd had you and we were putting together these materials. I think that's incredible to bring out the example of an interpreter is someone who translates as it is from one language to another. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Beautiful. Thank you, thank you. I really like what you said about not torturing the text, right? I was thinking of that statement about austerities in the mode of ignorance that torture the super soul. Yeah. I had a long talk with, I think it was Gopal Hari Prabhu about that. How can the super soul be tortured? But yeah, not to torture the text. Thank you very much. That's very nice. And I'm so glad you brought up this point, because then we also have other persons that Prabhupada refers to that identify Kurukshetra as the body and the Pandavas as the five senses of the body. And this is what Srila Prabhupada would say is a mad interpretation. So what hermeneutics does for us is it makes this boundary within which there's many different explanations and outside of which we have heresy. So what is a proper explanation? What is not a proper explanation? Yes. And in fact, that's you're hitting here on some of the many tools that we use. So you're hitting on a lot of the principles and a lot of the tools. And of course, we find that Srila Prabhupada often doesn't give an absolute literal translation. Yes, thank you. That is so well put. Thank you. I thought that was very nicely explained. Thank you. And you will see as we go through the principles and tools, we have a lot of principles and tools that deal with various kinds of contexts. Okay, I'm going to take one more on this, and then we're going to go on to the next thing. Excellent. And when we do the hermeneutic path tomorrow, we actually spend quite a bit of time on this in the foundation book, using the hermeneutic path in relation to oneself. So a lot of these are questions like that we're asking ourselves about our own biases. And we have biases, we have filters, we have motives. And to understand that we have those and to recognize them and be able to willfully, intentionally put them aside, or say, I'm not qualified to be able to explain this because my own biases, my own experiences are such that I'm not going to be able to give a proper interpretation. Yes, thank you. And we all have experience of this in our lives, don't we? We all have experience of having, talking with somebody and, we say something and the way that they interpret it is not what we intended. And it's like, wait a minute, that's not what I meant. I meant something else. And sometimes it's exactly the opposite, isn't it? I mean, I had this happen to me a few weeks ago when I was visiting someone and they said, make sure you take all your things. I think you left some of your things last time. So I put a little note on something in the kitchen and I said, this belongs to you. And as I was leaving, the person said, why did you put that note there? Are you telling me what I have to do with my things? I said, no, I was just the opposite. I was saying that this is not mine and you can do with it whatever you want. And I'm sure we've had experience of the opposite, where we misinterpret something that someone says. And we get, oh, why did they say that? How did they say that? So yeah, it's even within the same language. All right, the last question we're going to talk about right now is, why do we need hermeneutics? I mean, this has been another thing that people have asked. They say, well, we all know how to give classes on Prabhupada's verses and purports. What's the problem? Everything's clear. Everything's already known. Why do we need to study this? What good will it do for our ISKCON society to go into depth in a hermeneutical system? Thank you. Thank you for protecting the tradition. Yes. Thank you so much. Yes. And that happens all the time. I mean, all the time. I regularly get correspondence from people, I read this in the Shastra, or this thing that Prabhupada said, or this thing that, Jiva Goswami said, and I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how I can understand it. I don't know how I can accept it. It's really disturbing me. Stopping others is a little more difficult than stopping ourselves, in my experience. Yes. And your point about keeping the Siddhanta, again, we're going to be doing a deep dive into this tomorrow. How do we keep it? What do we mean by Siddhanta? How do we have a concise statement of Siddhanta? And the Shastric Advisory Council, especially Bhaktivedanta Maharaj, has done a tremendous amount of research and study to identify a concise statement of Siddhanta. As I said, again, we'll be doing a deep dive into this tomorrow. And then we know what is our basic Gaudiya Vaishnava Siddhanta. Sometimes the word is just, oh yeah, that's the Siddhanta, or that's not the Siddhanta. But to really make that clear, like Burjan Prabhu asked Srila Prabhupada, how do we know what are principles that can't be changed and details that can be changed? And Prabhupada said that requires intelligence. So hopefully we'll get that intelligence in these lessons. Well, it sounds like something I want to put on a metal plaque somewhere. Thank you. And in lesson 3 with Hari Parshad Prabhu, we're going to be going really deeply and sweetly. He's such a sweet teacher, into how to have respectful discussions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head as to what is a big misconception when people say, oh, we don't need hermeneutics. We're already using it. It just we may be using it badly. So I remember once attending a seminar where the teacher said, practice doesn't make perfect. If you're practicing the wrong thing, it simply makes the wrong thing more permanent. So if we have a wrong idea of how to explain Shastra and a wrong idea of how to understand Shastra, and we're doing it over and over again, we're simply solidifying something that is causing us trouble. And we find this problem in our ISKCON society. That was very deep. A lot of this we'll be discussing in lesson 3 about how to have discussions. And we have in our hermeneutic tool in the foundation, hermeneutic tool 21, which is some of Srila Prabhupada's statements have universal application, whereas others are applicable in a particular context. So some of Prabhupada's instructions were for a particular disciple. Like I know Prabhupada told one of my godbrothers, well, you're so busy milking the cows, it's okay if you don't chant your rounds. Or one of the most interesting was, I think it was within the same month, where 2 different devotees had written to Srila Prabhupada that they had stopped chanting their 16 rounds. One of them, Srila Prabhupada said, just chant for at least an hour before you go to work. The other one, Srila Prabhupada said, give up everything, move back in the temple, chant 64 rounds a day at least, and don't do any other service. And I have written to the temple president advising him of the same. So 2 disciples with apparently the same or a very similar problem and receiving 2 radically different instructions. Thank you. My apologies to those of you we didn't call on yet. We have to move on. If you haven't yet read the lesson, and we do ask that all of you read the lessons as part of your prep work, that you go through this at least after today. So we have a nice sample in your participant's handbook of Vaishnava hermeneutics used by Srila Prabhupada himself. So again, we do ask that all of you do your prep work for each lesson, your home fun. And part of that includes reading over the lesson, because in the lessons themselves, we're not going to be just reading everything to you. All right, I'd like you all now to turn to your participants manual on page 14. So participants manual, page 14. Participants manual, page 14. Where we're going to do exploration 1.1. So we have a lot of explorations in this course. Some are done individually, some are done in groups. This is going to be a group exercise. But before we go into our breakout rooms, which the admins are organizing, and I really want to give a big thanks to the many people that are being the admins. There's no way that I could teach this and manage the waiting room. So all of us, just a big, big thank you to the admins. If you take a look here at page 14, so we're going to be discussing this in groups. Experiences of poor conversation or misunderstanding about Shastra. Not names, please. No names. No names, no names, no names, no names. Nobody's saying, oh, so-and-so Maharaj or so-and-so Prabhu or so-and-so Devi does. No names. Just the general experience without names or enough details that we could identify someone. We're trying to look at the experience itself and not criticizing anyone. And then question 2, what difficult philosophical issues concern you? Are there any Shastric statements you have difficulty accepting? Again, this is a safe space. We are asking all of you present here that what is discussed here as far as people's doubts or difficulties stays here. We are going to be editing the recordings to take out any participant's statements and then making that edited recording available online. We will absolutely not share anything that reveals any of your questions. Now, if you're still hesitant in a breakout room, maybe you don't know the people, you're not sure if you can trust them, to talk about what statements you find difficult, or maybe you don't find any statements difficult, Then you can write down there what statements you know others have found difficult, or what might be statements that are difficult in preaching. Like Chitraketu had 10 million wives. You know, how did he have a time for each of the weddings and to still manage his kingdom? You know, so that might be a difficult statement that you found in your, maybe it doesn't bother you, but you might find that if you're distributing books to people and someone from the public says 10 million wives. I think that's the population of the greater metropolitan area of Detroit. And then what question do you have, if any, about hermeneutical theory? So again, if you don't personally have any question, you can bring up here what questions someone else might have. All right, so we're going to do a breakout room now for 15 minutes on your participants handbook, page 14. So if we can have the admins please arrange the breakout room. Hare Krishna. I hope that that you found that interesting. I'm going to take just a few minutes. If there's anything anybody would like to share, either in the chat or you can raise your hand from doing this exploration. Wow, thank you so much for a number of responses to that. I remember being shamed in a Bhagavatam class by the speaker when I asked a question. It was a horrific experience. I wanted to melt through the floor. The other thing you were saying about we don't want to just think that, yatapat tatapat, everything is okay. So hermeneutics makes a boundary by which it says outside this boundary, everything's not okay. And one of the clear ways of understanding that is that whatever conclusions we reach cannot violate any of these principles. So we don't have to use each of these principles every time, but we can't violate any of them. And your point about, and I know I've heard this, and I've heard this from a number of people, well, what Prabhupada says it's according to Shastra, that's absolute. And what Prabhupada says it's not in the Shastra, that's relative. We're not looking at things like that at all. And tomorrow, and I got a message from Bhaktivedanta Swami that he's in an Ayurvedic health clinic and his internet is terrible. And I'm thinking, I don't want to teach tomorrow's class too, Bhaktivedanta Maharaj. This is going to get ridiculous. Everybody's going to just drop out if I do that. But in tomorrow's class, which please, Krishna, have it be taught by Bhaktivedanta Maharaj, we go over the sample hermeneutical path. And I'd like all of you just briefly, I know this is a little preview, but if you can look at your foundation document, page 12. You can look at your foundation document, page 12. And again, we'll be doing this in depth tomorrow, hopefully with Maharaj. He said, call me right after the class. I'm having an internet problem. I'm like, one teacher with COVID, one teacher without internet. Here we're going to have how we understand things that are eternal, universal, and transcontextual, and things that are not. What's eternal, universal, and transcontextual, and things that are not. It is not the case that every single statement in Shastra is eternal, universal, and transcontextual. Sometimes in Shastra, we have statements of demons. Sometimes we have Krishna telling Nanda Maharaj just worship work itself. So the line is not, is it in Shastra or is it not in Shastra? It's a different line. Is this statement or this narrative about something that's universal, eternal, and transcontextual? Is it a contextualization of something that's universal, eternal, and transcontextual? Does it support that which is eternal, universal, and transcontextual? Or, like some of the statements of the demons in the Shastra, does it oppose what is universal, eternal, and transcontextual? Now, if the only thing you get out of these 8 lessons in hermeneutics is that one skill that's on page 12, if that's all you walk away from, all you walk away with from the 16 hours plus your prep time, so probably 24 hours altogether, that in and of itself will give you the understanding of what is a principle and what is a detail, and opens up the whole realm to understand what are the boundaries and what's outside of the boundaries. Everything else we do beyond that are additional helps, but that is the core. That is really the core. And again, we'll be doing that tomorrow. Krishna willing, it's about to begin, Marsh. And if you look in your, I'm the one now who has too many books here. If you look in your participant's handbook on page 18, and again, this is just a little window into tomorrow's class, and there you'll see, what do we mean by truths that are eternal, universal, and transcontextual? And here you'll see the Das Mula Tattva, Bhakti Vinod, and the 10 tenets of Gaudiya Siddhanta from Srila Prabhupada. To understand that more thoroughly, you need to go to the supplementary materials. Anybody else have anything they want to share from their breakout group? Wow, that was very enlivening. Thank you. There are also different levels and types of statements in the scripture. And yes, we have principles and tools specifically to deal with that. Okay, so I want to just stop there. I know some of you still have your hand raised, but I would like to move on. And I had a direct message here in the chat, something that was written just to me. So I won't say the name of the person, but it says, for the foundation document, I see this framework is based on ISKCON Gaudiya tradition. Will it help us to have a meaningful dialogue with other Sampradayas or even other members of the Gaudiya family? And I really like this question because it segues into how I want to end this session. So first, let's talk about the fact that what we have here in our ISKCON hermeneutics is firmly based on the Vedic and Vaishnava tradition, which is why we have that huge supplementary materials. And I was thinking, just looking through some of this, like texts are properly understood and explained in terms of the intended audience. That's principle 12. And we have like 1, 2, 2.5 pages of explanation and quotes from the scripture, showing that that is actually a principle of hermeneutics. Or I was looking at tool 9, consider nested narratives, and the fact that someone's speaking and they're quoting someone who's speaking, who's quoting someone who's speaking, and quoting someone who's speaking. And tool 10, which text provides a higher level of authority. And here we're looking at the Shruti, the Smriti, and I like what was brought up from the breakout rooms about sometimes people quoting scriptures that Srila Prabhupada and our Gaudiya Acharyas say are not relevant to us. But we know that some of the Puranas are in the mode of ignorance, or not for people who are in the mode of ignorance. Some of the Puranas are for people who are in the mode of passion. Some of the Puranas are positing word Shiva as God. And that's not the kind of place that we want to quote from. And so we have a huge amount of evidence here that there's different levels of Shastras. We have about 5 or 6 pages of evidence from the Shastras, from our Acharyas, that this is a valid and traditional hermeneutical tool. In other words, it's not that the members of the Shastric Advisory Council just sat down and speculated and said, what hermeneutical tools would we like to make up? But we looked at the tradition, we looked at what's being done. So in that sense, this hermeneutics, yes, it's relevant to people. Anyone who accepts the Vedic principles would accept the majority of our hermeneutical system. Now, why am I using the word majority? Why don't I say all of it? The reason I don't say all of it is we have a reason why we're calling this ISKCON hermeneutics. We all know that our difficulties for our own faith, for helping the devotees, or for outreach are not only about whether or not Chitraketu literally had 10 million wives or whether that's hyperbole. That's not the scope of our difficulty. But we have difficulty with certain statements from Srila Prabhupada himself. Now, for those who aren't members, for those in Sampradayas who aren't members of ISKCON, that's not an issue for them. Like we do a service in Govardhan and Radhakund, we clean the area and restore temples and we maintain the widows there. And I remember meeting one American who never was part of ISKCON, and she's initiated in the Nityananda Parivar without any connection with ISKCON. And I remember we were in a group and some statement of Prabhupada came up and she said, well, he's not in my line at all, so that just doesn't concern me. So we have that kind of a situation where we in ISKCON are particularly concerned about Srila Prabhupada's statements that may be difficult to understand. So therefore, there's a section of the hermeneutical principles and a section of the hermeneutical tools that deals specifically with Srila Prabhupada. And in those, we're taking ancient Vedic hermeneutical principles and tools, but we're applying them to understanding Srila Prabhupada. And so somebody in the Sri Sampradaya would say, well, that has nothing to do with me. Even some of our hermeneutical principles and tools are definitely geared toward the Gaudiya Sampradaya. That is a fact. At the same time, we have a hermeneutical system that allows us to interface with people who are not in the Vedic system at all, and allows us, this was a question put to me by one GBC member the other day. Do you really have a system that would allow us to speak to people completely outside of the Vedic paradigm, whether they're, religious scholars in Harvard, or whether they're, some local person coming to the Sunday feast? And the answer is yes. And we do that extensively. We look in lesson 7 at this, and also one of our exercises for lesson 8 is on that point. But it is a fact that it is impossible to come up with a hermeneutical system that would be agreed upon by all the sampradayas. And I remember having at least one devotee say, well, your ISKCON hermeneutics is no good because it can't be agreed on by all the sampradayas. And Krishna Kshetra Maharaj said they're asking for something that's impossible. It's not possible for all the sampradayas to absolutely agree on a hermeneutical system. Now, one of the reasons for that is that the lists of truths that are eternal, universal, and transcontextual will be slightly different from one sampradaya to another. And because that's a foundational core, it's just not going to be possible. Also, some hermeneutical principles and tools are going to be specific for our specific needs. So I thought that was a really good point. So we have another 15 minutes. At this point, we could end early, and maybe everybody would just be happy if we ended early. We have a little extra time in each of our lessons like this. But if anybody has anything that they'd like to bring up, any general points to end the lesson with, we can also take that. When is hermeneutics not applicable? Let's say you're dealing with something that's not a question of the words of sadhu shastra at all. You're dealing with some interpersonal situation in a temple that just doesn't have anything to do with the words of Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. What do you do with a pujari who's habitually late, but is a really sweet pujari? I mean, I'm sure you can find guidance in Shastra as to how to deal with such a person, and then you could take the guidance from Shastra and explain it using hermeneutics, but you're dealing with the person directly wouldn't necessarily be a hermeneutical thing at all. That is the whole topic of lesson 6 with Krishna Kshetra Maharaj. And are there things that we just say, whoa, this is a non-figurable, outable thing? What do we do? What do we do with those sort of things? Some of my most wonderfully, sorry to use ISKCON jargon, ecstatic preaching experiences was giving classes to Southern Baptist ministers. Now, those of you who are not from the United States may not know what a Southern Baptist is. Think of a born-again Christian, evangelical, kind of maybe your worst stereotype of a preaching Christian. And there's a university near here, the Southern Baptist Theological Union. One of the professors there is very favorable to our movement. And every year he would teach his students world religions. Now, the reason they studied world religions was to make them better missionaries. Okay? So their purpose in studying world religions was to know how to convert people from those religions to evangelical Christianity. It wasn't a benign motive. So, Veer Krishna Swami would always teach that class, but his father passed away, something like how I'm teaching this class. So his father passed away like the day before, and they threw me in at the last minute. And when I was speaking to the ministers, I focused on points of commonality. And we were able to get the ministers to chant. Shamala Kishori, who's here in this class, she and her sister and the other students went with us to their university for the second year. And the students, the high school students, had a bhajan and a kirtan, and the ministers were chanting Hare Krishna with the students. Just, I don't know, again, if you don't know what Southern Baptist Christians are, that might not make too much of an impression on you, but that was astronomically amazing. And what we focused on was explaining our scriptures and explaining Srila Prabhupada in ways that they could understand and relate to, and also trying to find the commonalities and learning from them. So yes, definitely studying hermeneutics well will make us good ambassadors, will make us be able to link with people, will make us, equip us with the ability to be able to deal with people who might normally be very oppositional, and get them to find common ground and common understanding. Is there anything else anybody would like to add before we close? You know, in the beginning days of ISKCON, we were ashram based, and we didn't so much work in the world. And things were fairly simple. Okay, here's Prabhupada's books, and this is how Srila Prabhupada explains things. I mean, even then, there were definitely statements Prabhupada made or statements in the scriptures that were difficult and that caused controversy and that caused misunderstanding and that caused lack of faith. I mean, in the early days, Prabhupada talking about the moon landing caused some people to leave the movement. But gradually, as ISKCON has expanded to a real society, where most of our members live outside temples, where many devotees now have studied Sanskrit and Bengali, where we have many members who are native Bengali speakers. We have many members who were trained in Shastra. You know, in the beginning days of ISKCON, it wasn't like that so much. But now we have many members who know the Vedas, who know the word. They came to ISKCON like that, who were brought up in ISKCON like that, and who are exposed to so many different views. And we started having a situation where certain people would take a strong stance on one thing or another and call as heretics and as fallen and as offensive anyone who didn't believe with their view. We also, as ISKCON grew, we were engaged more and more with outreach. And more some of the difficult statements that Prabhupada made began to be put on the internet. And people would say, well, what do I do with that? How do I deal with that? How do I explain that to people? How do I explain that to myself? So I think as ISKCON has grown and we've matured, we've come to need more of these traditional tools. I mean, Srila Prabhupada wanted us to start a society that was based on traditional principles, that was based on Shastric principles, or you could say Vedic principles, though Vedic is a hot word. And we needed to do that. So frankly, my personal opinion is that the need for hermeneutics is way past when it was really needed, that it was really needed 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And had we worked on developing this then, we could have prevented a lot of the difficulty that we're functioning with today. But at least, you know, as Prabhupada said, Krishna consciousness should be started at the beginning, or at least from one's understanding of its importance. So at least if we can start now, my own, again, personal hope is that as we start training more and more people in hermeneutics, we will grow a culture. We will grow other people who are teaching it. We have a devotee right now in Gainesville who's teaching hermeneutics after having taken the course twice. And Bhaktivedanta Maharaj has taught the course in Russian translation twice to over 200 devotees total. So as that happens, the culture of ISKCON will change. We'll have, as you'll see in lesson 3 with Hari Parshad, we'll move from Jalpa and Vitanda conversations to Vada and Samvada conversations. So I see it as quite necessary. Does that answer your question? Is that all right? I think you're going to get that question. That's a great question. You know, pulling out the inconceivable card, right? When someone just said, well, thank you for your question. The answer is it's inconceivable. So we'll be looking at that as we go through. Yes. And you just brought out a good reason to learn hermeneutics. The fact that the inconceivable card is played way too often is simply a result of people not understanding the qualities, principles, and tools of hermeneutics. And once we have that, then we're not going to pull out a hammer for every construction problem. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We will meet again tomorrow by Krishna's grace. Please pray that we can get the internet issues sorted out for Bhakti Vigyan Maharaj. I want to, again, ask all of you, please make sure that you have all the materials and that you do the home fun, not homework, home fun. It's not long home fun. It shouldn't take you a very long time. And that way you will come prepared. We're going to be doing a lot of deep exercises tomorrow, and we look forward very much to having you all with us. And I hope tomorrow I will just be a participant. So thank you again. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Prabhupada ki jai. And please again pray for the full and speedy recovery of Radhika Raman. Hare Krishna.